Okay, thank you, Cal, for reminding me. Okay, yes, so that's a book there. Okay, and in June, you very kindly agreed to give us a second talk on another project you're leading on, which is Site of Jewish Liberal Sociability, Politics and Activism, a major project on Jewish country houses, uh, which I'm sure will be very exciting. And who knows, if we ever get out into the world again, maybe we can meet you at one of these country homes like Waddesdon or something.
Well, in fact,
Go on.
so I'm going to be presenting with Tom, but another of my colleagues is, I think, going to be leading two separate tours of British country houses, I mean, Anglo-Jewish country houses this summer. So one of them is, I haven't got the details with me, but I know one of them is advertised. It's it's going to be Hewenden, Watersden and Upton. And I think the other one will be for B'nai Brit, maybe. Anyway,
okay, and the third one's for
not able
Belmont.
to go on foreign holidays, but you can tour Jewish country houses in the UK with Marcus.
Okay, well, oh, right, we look forward to that. And a special one for Belmont. Today, we're going to hear about the lives of Lady Judith and Sir Moses Montefiore. Personally, I was thinking about this, and I think we have to go back almost to biblical times to find a couple, not a single man or a single woman, but actually a couple who had such an impact on Jewish life as did Lady Judith and Sir Moses. We're 6 nights away from Pesach. It's a signal time to hear something of their story. It's 877 years since the first blood libel, the accusation binding together Pesach and Easter. On or about 22nd of March 1144, William, a young boy in Norwich, was found dead, with Pesach a week away. The calumny that we murder Christian children for blood to make matzvah was born. 696 years later, this libel appeared for the first time in the Middle East, in Damascus, again perpetrated by Christian ministers. Sir Moses and Lady Judith led an international group to quash this outrageous claim and save the lives of the imprisoned, tortured and raped leaders of Damascus Jewry. Today, 21st of March 2021, 180 years and 1 week ago, Lady Judith and Sir Moses attended a service of thanksgiving at the UK's Premier Shul, Bevis Marks, for their safe return and for the success. It was only 10 days before Pesach, 1841. And for those who wonder, I looked it up, I wasn't actually there. I will be inviting Professor Green this evening to finish this evening with a reading still used to conclude their family Seder, that of the Sebag Montefiore's, each year, an extract from the diary of Sir Moses. Before we do that, Abigail, we always start out by just asking people to give us a little bit of background about themselves, where they grew up, and what their career development was, how you became a historian. So if you just tell us a little bit about yourself before you start talking about Lady Judith and Sir Moses.
So I'm a Londoner. I grew up in West London. I don't know what to say about how I became I always wanted to be a historian, so I can't really say anything very interesting about that. From a young age, I wanted to be a historian. I bought a book. I used to read historical fiction. That's how I got into it as a child. But a lot of it passed me right over my head, but I was very interested in kings and queens. I think it was, now I come to think of it, it was the Queen's Silver Jubilee which did it. And so I always wanted to be a historian. I was lucky enough to study history at Magdalen College in Oxford. And I had a bit of a wall and considered trying something else. So I spent a year studying European politics in Brussels, but that was very boring. So then I went to Cambridge and did German history, having spent my gap year in Germany, and I wrote Fatherlands. But I guess I wanted to do something I felt more connected with. So that's how I ended up working on Montefiore, because my mother was a Sebag Montefiore, so I could see that there was a gap there. And now I feel like I'm quite, I was very naive. I didn't really understand what was involved in writing this book, or how many different languages I would have to engage with, and the funding I would need to acquire in order to support that. But fortunately, it doesn't seem to have mattered. I mean, I'm glad I embarked upon it. And so I guess now I see myself as working between European history and international Jewish history.
Okay, thank you very much. And you're going to talk to us about Lady Judith and Sir Moses.
So I want to share my screen.
Okay.
It's a slightly unprofessional PowerPoint, but that's what we are nonetheless going to go with. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so now I'll see if I can get into the slideshow. Yes? Is that good?
Yes, it's there.
Indeed, this is a book about Sir Moses and Lady Judith Montefiore, between tradition and modernity. And I guess some of it, well, you could simply read the book, but the focus on it is a bit different. But maybe it'll make you want to read the book, so that would be a good thing. So I guess what I'm going to do in this book is to think about Sir Moses and Lady Judith as individuals, who they were, what they cared about, and how their lives reflected the cultures into which they were born and the society that shaped them. And I'm going to start with this portrait of them as a young couple. We think it's an engagement portrait. It's the only one of its kind I'm familiar with. And I like it because they are just a young couple. So in later life, they became icons. But in this picture, we can see that they're just a young couple looking rather European, a bit awkward with one another, and about to embark on married life in late Georgian London. And what I'm going to do is look at them individually, really, and then think about how we might think about their lives in terms of the tension between tradition and modernity in the European 19th century, or perhaps between Jewishness and Englishness. So let's start with Sir Moses. I've put some key dates down here. So he was born in Livorno in 1784, 5 years before the French Revolution. Very much a product of the cosmopolitan Western Sephardic diaspora. So that was a kind of transatlantic phenomenon, really, but with deep roots in the Anglo-Jewish business elite as well. And as you may know, the Western Sephardi diaspora was forged when they were expelled from Spain and Portugal at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. And the shape of this diaspora reflected the rise of world maritime empires: Venetian, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French. Because they were members of a scattered but culturally close-knit community, Sephardic Jews created highly specialized trading networks supported by ties of religion and family that cut across empires and oceans. And this, in fact, was very true of the Montefiores, who were a typical product of this history. So, fearing for their lives, their ancestors, the Carvajals, had converted to Christianity but continued to live as secret Jews. They left Spain for Portugal to escape the Inquisition and later relocated to Mexico, where Luis Carvajal rose to become, in fact, a provincial governor, but the Inquisition eventually caught up with him, and he and his son died in prison. His daughter was burned at the stake, but it seems that his grandson escaped to central Italy, where he took the name Montefiore. And it was the descendants of this Montefiore who settled in the port of Livorno, a mecca for Sephardic Jews because it was a place where they were protected from the. It was a town which had tried to encourage Jewish immigration and Jewish trade by allowing people who had converted to Christianity to come out again as Jews without risk to themselves. And Livorno was a very important trading centre for many different reasons, but in the 18th century, the trade with Britain was becoming increasingly important, and some of the trading families in Livorno began to establish branches in London. And it was this that brought Montefiore's grandfather, Moses Vita, to London, who nonetheless retained close ties with family back in Livorno. And I'm going to have to take a break because my son is interrupting me. I'm so sorry. And I don't know how to mute myself. Moshe, I'm talking. He's disappeared now. I don't know what to do. Moshe, I'm talking to 50 people.
Yeah, I tried to call you quietly, but you didn't answer. Anyway, one thing tonight.
Yes, but not now. Can you go downstairs, please?
I did a leave of it this time, and I
Moshe.
should have the Zinc bow.
Okay, can you go downstairs?
Which I Lily and Thomas have read it now.
Abigail, you need to unmute yourself. I muted you just so that you could talk to your son without us all knowing about it. So you need to unmute yourself.
Can you unmute it?
No.
There you go.
There we are. Okay. No. How do I go back? Sorry about that. What I was going to say was at the beginning of the lockdown, he was he was extremely respectful, but now it's become kind of hopeless, and he just on me all the time because he no longer takes it seriously what I'm doing. So yes, where were we? Oh, the Anglo-Italian trade. So this was why Sir Moses's grandfather, Moses Vita Montefiore, moved to London but retained close ties with family. And his father, Joseph, traded on these connections and developed his own successful business, trading in Livorno bonnets, which was a kind of straw hat, which was very fashionable in the 1780s. But as you may imagine, the French Revolutionary Wars put an end to successful trade in Livorno bonnets, which was not good for Joseph's business. So hero, Moses Montefiore, was in fact born in Livorno on one of his father's business trips to Italy, and he was brought up to nurture ties with his Italian great-uncle and godfather, who was called Moses Racca, and other members of his cosmopolitan family who had bases in West Indies, North America, and eventually Australia. So that's one side of his family. But on the other side, his mother, who was born Rachel Lombroso de Matos Mocata, was descended from one of the first Jewish families to be readmitted to England under Cromwell. And her family connections meant that he was also very well embedded in the more settled world of the City of London and its financial business elite. And by the late 1780s, the Western Sephardic diaspora was really firmly in decline. And so it's not surprising that young Moses decided to follow his mother's family as he sought his way in the world. And here we can now revert to these key dates in his life. So he married Judith Baron Cohen in 1812. When Napoleon was retreating from Moscow. She was the sister-in-law of Nathan Rothschild, which was obviously a useful contact to have. And by 1819, he'd made a fortune on the stock exchange. In the 1820s, he founded a string of spectacular successful businesses, most notably the Alliance Assurance, which still survives. But he'd always had a religious streak, and in 1827 he and Judith set off on a life-changing pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, this wasn't actually as unusual as it sounds in the Sephardic world. In fact, boatloads of Jewish tourists left Livorno for Jaffa on an annual basis, and it was a kind of common thing for Ottoman Jews to try and go at least once to Jerusalem. But I think for a businessman, it was an unusual step. And this map gives you a sense of what such a pilgrimage might mean in 1827. And it's not just that it was a hard journey to make at a time when before international railways and steamships, but actually there was a war going on in the Mediterranean, the War of Greek Independence. There was substantial problems with piracy, which meant that sailing was a risky activity, and it was really quite an undertaking. But for Moses and Judith, it was a life-changing experience. It took them from the world of Cheapside to the world of Jerusalem, a very different place. And it was a moment this pious man resolved to become a properly observant Jew and to devote his life to observing mitzvot. And in fact, this excerpt, which the letter I'm going to read you at the end, comes from his return trip in 1827. So if we go back to the key dates slide, we can see in the 1830s, he devoted himself to Anglo-Jewish politics and the campaign for Jewish emancipation. He became president of the Board of Deputies. And this was also the period when he bought a country house, Eastcliff Lodge in Ramsgate, and built a synagogue there, and supposedly allowed Princess Victoria to enjoy his garden when she visited Ramsgate in 1835. Then, in 1837, the year she acceded to the throne, Sir Moses served as the second Jewish sheriff of the City of London, which was actually not just an honorific role, although there was a lot of pomp and circumstance involved. And he was lucky enough to be knighted, because Victoria knighted both the city sheriffs to mark her accession to the throne. But throughout this period, he remained engaged with the poor of Jerusalem and played an increasingly important role in fundraising efforts on their behalf, setting out in 1839 on a second trip to Palestine, this time bringing money to help survivors of a terrible earthquake in the Galilee, which had destroyed the ancient walls of Tiberias and sent the city of Sfat tumbling to the ground. And if you visited Tiberias, you'll know that the walls were never rebuilt, so you can see the relics of that earthquake. During this visit, Sir Moses, as he now was, made contact with all the leading figures in the growing Jewish communities in Palestine and took upon himself to raise money for them in the diaspora when he returned home. And he also entered into rather detailed conversations about the possibility of renting agricultural land on a large scale. And his idea was that the Jews there would rent the land, and they would use the profits to make them sustainable, so that they weren't any more dependent on diaspora charity. And he also hoped that if this was successful, it would encourage more Jews from Eastern Europe to make their home there as an escape from persecution, because this was a time when life was becoming harder for Jews in Russia under Tsar Nicholas I. And in fact, his plans were so advanced that he returned to London via Alexandria in the hope of persuading Mehmet Ali, who was then the ruler of Syria as well as Egypt, to endorse his venture. And I think it's really for this reason, so it's about 40 years before the birth of Zionism, that he is seen as a kind of pioneering Zionist avant la lettre. And it's also at this moment, in 1839 to 40, that he begins to emerge as an international Jewish leader. And the process was really cemented by the Damascus affair of 1840, to which David has referred, when Sir Moses famously travelled to Alexandria with his French Jewish counterpart, the lawyer Adolphe Rémieux, and obtained the release of prominent members of the Damascus Jewish community who had been accused of ritual murder. So they were accused, indeed, of using the blood of murdered Christians to bake matzot. This issue was particularly sensitive for Jews in Europe in 1840, partly because the accusation had been made by French Catholics, and especially the French consul, and also because it was believed, if people in Europe believed that the Damascus Jews had been killing Christians to make Passover bread, then it was hard to make a case really for Jewish emancipation. So there was great concern about the spread of this calumny. So with one eye really to a European public, he travelled on from Alexandria after obtaining the release of the prisoners to Constantinople, where he met with a young Ottoman sultan and obtained a document, a firman, which condemned the blood libel as a calumny and appeared to offer equal rights to Ottoman Jews. Although, in fact, what it really did was to confirm the protections already offered to Jews under Sharia law, because they were peoples of the book. So taken together, these two initiatives, the project for agricultural colonization in Palestine and the mission to Damascus, I think we can see them as defining Montefiore's career as a Jewish leader in later life, because the key elements are there already: love for the land of Israel, a place at the heart of diaspora fundraising for Jews in Palestine, but also elsewhere, and a diplomatic role which entailed foreign missions and high-profile meetings with rulers and their ministers. So I think what we really see with Sir Moses are three different facets of Jewish leadership. The first of them relates to Palestine. He, in fact, travelled 5 times more to Palestine. The last time, when he was 90, I think he would have been happy to die there. Obviously, that's a mitzvah. And each of these visits was connected with efforts to revitalise the Jewish communities there and render them more productive and less dependent on the diaspora, not just through agriculture, but also through proto-industrial activities like weaving, through building the famous windmill and pioneering Jewish housing outside the walls of the old city, and through sponsoring a slightly more modern approach to Jewish education. So that's Palestine. The second of these threads, fundraising, saw Sir Moses really emerge as the linchpin of international fundraising efforts on behalf of Jewish communities abroad. There are lots of different examples of this. I particularly like the example of the Jewish refugees from the Spanish-Moroccan War of 1860 taking refuge on the Rock of Gibraltar. But we could talk also about, for instance, the Persian famine of 1872, which killed about a quarter of the population. Unusually, I think, but noteworthily, he also took the lead raising money on behalf of Christians in Syria after the massacres of the early 1860s. And this was, in a way, an attempt to establish a kind of quid pro quo where Christians had given to the Jews in Gibraltar and Jews were now giving to the Christians in Syria. And I think what's striking is that on the one hand, he continued to act as a conduit for the traditional flow of money from diaspora communities to Palestine, which was known as Chalukah and had been around, something which had been happening for 200 or 300 years by then. But he also began to respond to other kinds of disaster and pioneered new approaches, deploying the language of humanitarian sympathy to raise money from non-Jews, particularly in the British Empire and North America, and making brilliant use of the opportunities created by the mass press. And finally, I think we should talk about his high-profile diplomatic missions on behalf of Jews in parts of the world where Jewish life was difficult, where he kind of revitalized the established tradition of Stadlanut, which was intercession by wealthy Jews on behalf of the less privileged brethren. But what was distinctive about Sir Moses' interventions was that he wasn't intervening in London as a wealthy London Jew on behalf of Londoners, but he was going to other countries and intervening there instead. And here we can see two different sets of images. So on the one hand, if we look at this kind of collage of images from the Illustrated London News, we can see he's shaking hands with Nicholas I of Russia, and we can see him also sitting talking to Mehmet Ali of Egypt. And the other image shows him in 1864 meeting with the Sultan of Morocco. And these were some of his most high-profile visits. But they weren't the only ones. He travelled several times to Constantinople, met with the Sultan and obtained authorization for his charitable initiatives in Palestine. In 1859, he travelled to Rome and met with the Pope's Secretary of State, Cardinal Antonelli, in an effort to obtain the release of a young Jewish boy called Edgardo Mortara, who had been secretly baptized by a family servant and then taken from his parents so that he could be brought up by the church authorities as a good Catholic. So this was a very shocking episode, which aroused an awful lot of public attention. In 1864, as you can see, he visited the Sultan of Morocco in Marrakesh, highly unusual for a European to visit Marrakesh because it was basically closed to Europeans. And he obtained there a document quite similar to that which he had been granted by the Ottoman Sultan in 1840, so confirming really the privileges of Sharia law. In 1867, he travelled to Bucharest and spoke with Prince Carol of Romania in a futile attempt, really, to try and stop the kind of anti-Jewish outrages in Romania. So you probably have heard of the pogroms in Russia, but in fact, Romania was a kind of running sore in international Jewish politics in the late 19th century. And I think it's worth noting that Sir Moses was actually well over 50 when he set out on the first of his famous diplomatic missions, and nearly 90 when he returned from the last. So it was quite a feat. And his flair for publicity and the international nature of his activities really enabled him to build a global reputation certainly in the Jewish world, but also among non-Jews who celebrated him not just as a kind of parochial Jewish figure, which is how he tends to be remembered, but as a great humanitarian. And here I think it's worth taking a moment to consider how he appeared at different moments in his public career, and how the different facets of his career were reflected in the image he projected. So if we look at this early picture of him in 1818 as a kind of young Regency buck on the stock exchange, he looks like one kind of person, and then we see him a much more establishment figure in his sheriff's uniform with the firman he was given by the Sultan of in Constantinople. And finally, we see him in an older age, obviously wearing some kind of kippah, still wearing the high-necked shirts of the Regency period, which we see in 1818. So he appears to have become a bit more religious over this period. And if anything, it's not a kind of trajectory from tradition to modernity, but rather perhaps from modernity to tradition. So now I'm going to talk about Judith. And I want to think a bit about how she fits into this broader picture and how thinking about her can help us think maybe differently or more richly about Sir Moses' life and work. So Judith was born in 1784. She was the daughter of Levi Baron Cohen, who was a wealthy Ashkenazi businessman from Holland originally, and so she wasn't Sephardic. She was Ashkenazic, and although obviously Holland was one of the few places in the 18th century world where Ashkenazim and Sephardim lived side by side. Judith was well educated in a conventional Western sense, but she also had enough Hebrew to follow the service and read the weekly Torah portion. You can see that her father obviously looks like a pretty European chap. He doesn't present himself in an observant way. He doesn't have a beard, for example, but he did correspond with a rabbi about whether it was acceptable to carry an umbrella on Shabbat. So clearly Judith was brought up in a properly Jewish family environment. She married Montefiore in 1812. And at this point in time, they were actually quite unusual in marrying across the Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide. And they clearly did see themselves as a kind of cross-cultural couple. So she learnt Italian, and he used to refer to her jokingly as his liebe Frau. And I think the desire to cross this Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide did become a central feature of his philanthropic agenda in later life. And it was something which was reflected both in Mishkanot Sha'ananim, the housing he founded outside the walls of the Holy City in Jerusalem, and in Ramsgate, where he established the Lady Judith Montefiore College, which was a kollel dedicated to his wife's memory. Because in both places, he aimed to bring together equal numbers of Sephardi and Ashkenazi rabbis, although his success in this was mixed. And in my book, I talk about his pioneering role as an international Jewish activist and in the globalization of Jewish consciousness. And I think the fact that he was able to bridge the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide and wanted to do so was an important dimension of this achievement. But Judith also provided Montefiore with more concrete assets that were the foundation of his career, most obviously wealth and family connections. Money in the shape of a generous dowry, and this family tie to the Rothschilds through her sister Hannah, pictured here, who was the wife of Nathan Rothschild, whose meteoric rise to the apex of the financial system precisely coincided with Montefiore's own somewhat less spectacular, but still quite spectacular rise to fortune and influence. And in fact, Henrietta Rothschild, who was Nathan's sister, married Sir Moses' brother Abraham Montefiore. So this was a further connection between the two families. Now, wealth wasn't an absolute prerequisite for the kind of international leadership in the Jewish world which Montefiore provided. We think of people like Adolf Chemieux, who accompanied him to Damascus, or the journalist and reform rabbi Ludwig Philippson. They were both pivotal figures, but they came from different backgrounds. But I do think that Sir Moses' ability to access the sultans of Turkey and Morocco reflected the awareness of those sultans, of his relationship with the Rothschilds, and the assumption that he was acting in a way as their agent, and might perhaps be able to facilitate good value loans. So in this sense, the Rothschild relationship, which Judith was very keen to foster, was critical, I think, to his influence. In the more global world of the 19th century, it represented a kind of internationalization of the nexus between finance and influence, which had always underpinned the practice of Stadtlandnut, or intercession. Now, Judith and Montefiore were childless. It seems likely that Judith was infertile, because it also seems likely that Montefiore had some illegitimate children. Clearly, their childlessness was a personal tragedy. But I think, importantly, also, it was a fundamental force driving their philanthropy and public activity, creating a void at the heart of the married life, which they sought to fill in other ways. And I think it's striking that one of the documents which was retained in the family archive was this fertility amulet written for Judith Montefiore in 1827, when she was in her late 40s, and visited the tomb of Rachel. Had Montefiore had children, he might perhaps have seen greater purpose in his business activity and turned his efforts to founding a dynasty rather than to other kinds of charitable and public achievements. And if Judith had had children, I think it does seem likely that her attention would have been diverted elsewhere, and she would have had neither the time nor inclination to accompany her husband on his various expeditions, or to forge a role for herself as a player in the world of international Jewish activism in her own right. So I think we can also identify three different strands to Judith's contribution to Montefiore's life and work. First of all, she was his travel companion. She accompanied him to Damascus, to Russia, to Rome, and on 5 of his 7 trips to Palestine. She died in 1862. And when we consider that in 1827, she was actually one of only 6 Western European women to visit Palestine in the past 100 years, I think we can see how unusual this kind of travel really was. Now, as you can see, these were very gendered worlds. And so Judith's presence added an important dimension to her husband's interaction with the people and societies he encountered. So she was often, as is the case here, the only woman present, but we also find her observing the High Holy Days in the Ladies' Gallery of the private Fua Synagogue in Alexandria, visiting the tomb of Rachel, accompanied by a group of Jewish women in 1827, while her husband toured the male study houses of the Holy City, socializing with the ladies of the Egyptian royal household when she visited the harem in Alexandria, and inspiring a group of Warsaw widows to found a charitable association when she came in 1846 to Warsaw. And this testimonial, which belongs to the Montefiore Endowment, helps us to understand the ways in which Judith functioned as a role model for women in leadership positions in other parts of the Jewish world. So we can see that they describe her as the leading example of our association, and they also want to do like her and to make her the head of their association, probably because they hope also that she might be generous to it. The second important thing is that Judith acted as Montefiore's publicist. So, and she wrote for a number of different publics. So it's possible that you're familiar with her cookbook, the Jewish Manual, which was actually the first Jewish cookbook published in English. And this is a kind of feminine take on the difficulties of combining English-style gentility with religious observance. So her husband used to take a kosher chicken with him when he attended dinners, official dinners in the City of London, and have them rescheduled if they clashed with religious holidays. But Judith was concerned to demonstrate that one could make an elegant meat sauce without butter, although having now twice had the opportunity to eat food from this cookbook, I think it's open to question whether she succeeded in this terribly well. Her literary contribution to her husband's agenda was, however, much more significant than the Jewish Manual, which is what she tends to be remembered for now. Female travel writers were rare in the world of Western European letters, but Judith privately published accounts of both her first and second trips to Palestine, and she was, I think, as a Jewish travel writer women travel writer in the 1830s and early 40s, highly unusual. I mean, now I say that, I'm thinking about Fanny Lewald, who did produce travelogues, but obviously she never really went beyond Italy, while Judith travelled far and wide. And her travel diaries demonstrate genuine literary aspiration, but they were also taken seriously by the broader Jewish public. So her 1839 diary was actually really intended as an intervention in public debates about how best to support the Jewish community in Palestine. It was published in 1844 together with some translated letters to Montefiore from local Jewish leaders who apparently approved of his plans for agricultural colonization, and it was then excerpted in French in the Univers Israélite, and it even attracted the attention of the future founder of religious Zionism, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who wrote to Montefiore requesting a copy. And after Judith's death in 1862, it was reprinted in Hebrew translation by Sir Moses' secretary, Louis Levy, and served as a major reference point in the productivization debates of the 1870s. So I think it is extremely unusual to see a woman intervening in public controversies in the Jewish world in this way at this time. Finally, Judith was herself a player in the world of international Jewish philanthropy and international philanthropy altogether. So in Warsaw, we've seen that she was an inspiration to others. And in Britain, we find her active not just in communal charities, but also sitting on the board of international British charities with women like Florence Nightingale and Lady Shaftesbury, whose husband was a leading Christian Zionist during the Crimean War, for example. In Palestine, meanwhile, Judith was regarded as an almost equal partner in her husband's endeavours. Charitable associations regularly empowered her to act as a gabayit, or fundraiser or treasurer, in her own right, partly because they presumably hoped she would give them money herself, and partly because I think they understood very well that she represented a new source of charity through her connections with the wealthy Jewish women of the West. And this slide gives two different impressions of her charitable activity in Palestine. So on the one hand, we can see her sitting next to Montefiore as he distributed alms in Sfat. But it was also Judith who proposed refurbishing the decrepit tomb of Rachel, which was the model then for her own tomb in Ramsgate. And it was actually Judith who instigated her husband's most controversial initiative in Palestine, which was a girls' school teaching Hebrew and sewing, established in 1855, for which, in fact, a herem was issued against him. And here I think it's worth taking a moment to consider how she appeared at different moments in her life. And the contrast with her husband is, I think, instructive. So you'll remember we had that transition from the Regency buck to the little black hat. But while his image did change quite dramatically with the years, I think the same is much less true of Judith. So if we look at these two pictures, we can see she's a bit older, a bit less décolleté in the second image. But I think there are no clues to suggest that she became more religious or traditional or less worldly with age, unlike her husband. There's no female equivalent of the little black hat. What should be apparent by this point, I hope both from what I've said and from the images you've seen, is that the Montefiores travelled between different worlds, quite literally. Some of these worlds were traditional, places like Palestine, Vilna, and Warsaw, and some were more modern. After all, Britain epitomised modernity in the early to mid-19th century. As the 19th century wore on, the concept of progress became increasingly loaded. Both as a Jew and an Englishman, Montefiore would have identified with it as a Jew because he saw Jewish emancipation as a hallmark of progress and civilization, and as an Englishman because he saw the British Empire as the standard bearer of civilization and humanity. He was, moreover, an enthusiast for modern technology, a pioneer of gaslighting in the metropolises of Europe, and eager in old age to attend synagogue service in Ramsgate virtually by a kind of telephone, so I think he would have approved of the world of Zoom. Nor could such a well-travelled man fail to appreciate the ways in which modern technology, rail, steam and telegraph bound the world together in new ways. So this was a man who embraced modernity, both in terms of technological innovation and as a value system that conveyed the Western ideals of civilization and humanity, in quotes. And I guess if I were asked to focus on the transformative nature of his impact in the Jewish world, then I think I would be thinking about the way he embraced that discourse of civilization and humanity and understood that it provided a way of universalizing concern for Jews in distress, and the way in which he seized the opportunities of modern technology to bring the Jewish world together in new ways. But embracing modernity didn't make him either less Jewish or more English. And this brings me to Ramsgate, where the Montefiores manifested their Jewishness in ways that were strikingly English. So this was their country house, Eastcliff Lodge, and they proceeded to build that's the interior, the Gothic library. They proceeded to build a small private synagogue in Ramsgate, which you can still visit, so that they could observe Judaism when in the country, just as a Christian gentleman might worship in his private chapel or local parish church. And when Judith gave her wedding dress to make a Torah mantle, she underlined not just the extent to which this was a joint project, but also the place of Jewish practice at the heart of their marriage. And I think it was this really which made Eastcliff Lodge so unique. Because although Sir Moses was by no means the only Jew to buy a grand country pile and live the life of an English gentleman, I think the Jewishness of Eastcliff Lodge was very different from that of other country houses precisely because of the synagogue and the Judith College. Many rich Jews had country houses, and sometimes these houses had private prayer rooms, but this freestanding synagogue in its rural English setting at Ramsgate, which we can see here in this amazing historic photograph, with the clear intention of attracting a small congregation, is unique to my knowledge. And it was here that he chose to establish the Judith Lady Montefiore College in his wife's memory, a kind of idiosyncratic institute of higher learning which fused the traditional Jewish rabbinical kollel with a kind of British Oxbridge College type geography. And the key point here, I think, is that the Montefiore's ceaseless travels and extensive exposure to less anglicised forms of spirituality to places like Sfat broadened their horizons and reinforced their commitment to more traditional and less acculturated forms of religious practice, but obviously not undermining their pride in Britishness. So we find Judith apparently making a fertility pilgrimage to the tomb of Rachel as early as 1827, while in 1846, when they visited Vilna, they reportedly spent hours praying and weeping at the tomb of the Vilna Gaon. Nowadays, as you know, the position of women in Judaism is one of the key dividing lines between traditional and reform religious practice. But when Judith accompanied her husband to Palestine in 1839, her experiences transcended those normally reserved for women. She was repeatedly led to a place of honour in the synagogue and allowed to participate in the Torah service, although by lighting the lamps in front of the ark or dressing and undressing the Torah scroll, rather than anything more vocal. For instance, when she visited Sfat, she was given a seat opposite the ark and played an important role in the ceremonial inauguration of a particularly venerated Sefer Torah. And if any of you have visited Sfat, you'll know that these synagogues are tiny. So if you're at the heart of the service by the bimah, you're really surrounded by men. It's not that you're in any kind of separate space. When the Hasidic leader, Rabbi Abraham Dov, carried this Sefer Torah through the streets of the town at the head of a procession of Hasidim singing and dancing and clapping their hands, Judith took her place under the chuppah immediately behind him, bearing a lighted taper. And really the point I want to make is twofold. On the one hand, she does appear to have encountered greater latitude about what was and wasn't acceptable for her as a woman in Sfat than she did back home in England, or than women in Sfat would encounter today. On the other hand, her response seems equally unexpected. So Western European Jews habitually denigrated the charismatic religious style of the Hasidim. They found it kind of embarrassing and garish and kind of they couldn't relate to it at all. And Judith, in fact, was attuned to evangelical religious sensibilities. She was concerned with decorum in synagogue and used to practicing her faith behind closed doors. But actually, she was thrilled by this experience of Tzfat. She described it here as the beauty of holiness in the midst of the desolation. And you can see that it was pretty desolate. And the episode, I think, shows us how a couple that was absolutely English, if we think of their dress and social circles in which they were moved, or the aspirations to gentility which are so apparent in their country house, was both accepting of and accepted by traditional Jewish society in other parts of the world. Now, partly this reflected a power imbalance. Jews in Eastern Europe and Palestine had to accept the Montefiores as they were, beardless, westernized, dripping in diamonds, as Judith apparently was in Vilna, because they needed what the Montefiores represented, wealth and political influence. But I think the timing of all this was also a critical factor. Born in the 18th century, Sir Moses had one foot in the traditional Jewish world of his childhood, even as he placed another foot in the British establishment. It was this, the world of his childhood, the Western Sephardic diaspora, that vanished in his lifetime. Lacking this contact and those connections, subsequent generations of the Anglo-Jewish elite mostly could not bridge these two societies in the same way. So, thank you.
Abigail, stunning. Absolutely amazing. I recommend everybody to read this biography. It is a fantastic biography. And honestly, anybody who can plough through the minutes of the Board of Deputies from the 1840s deserves a peerage. I've tried it. It's dreadful stuff. But really amazing. And it just brings to life their life and what they did, what they achieved so much. We are 7 days away from Pesach. And just before, I'm going to ask you to read a letter in a minute. Before you do that, just to remind people that Abigail is going to present to us on the English Country Homes in June.
Not just English.
Oh, no, sorry. I apologize. Jewish Country Homes.
It's a European.
Yeah, no, I got it. I remember that. And is apparently going to take us to the Italian and Parisian ones herself at some point, please God. Or at least maybe we'll get to some of the ones in England that we have all heard of. Waddesdon, Hughesdon. Upton, what is Upton? I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that one.
Upton belonged to the Beersteds. Walter Samuel. The Beersteds were very active in a whole range of different Jewish causes, including the kinder transport, which was partly administered and
gosh.
But also, we will actually talk quite a lot about, because I'm doing it with Tom, he talks a lot about Upton in our talk. So.
Okay, so we'll look forward to that. My father was a beneficiary of the kinder transport, and I guess without it, I wouldn't be here. And I think there's several people on as well. So we're going to be hearing about that. But as it's approaching Pesach, it's 6 or 7 days away. Moshe has calmed down, it seems. Well done there. And just to share with us how your family conclude your Seder, because I found it so moving.
In our family, my mother's family, we conclude by reading this letter. You going to share it? I wouldn't mind sharing it.
Yeah. Yes. Hold on. Let's see me sort myself out here.
I just had to share it.
Okay. Now I've got to. Can you see it on the screen?
That's
Carol. Carol, can you see it on the screen?
Yeah, it's there now.
Okay.
So we call it the letter. It's not really a letter. It's a diary entry. And actually, I've come to realize that it's not the same as the diary entry in the 1827 diary. It's kind of a bit more developed, but relates to an episode which happened. And we always read it because for Sir Moses, this was his Passover miracle. And I should explain that it's a traditional Sephardic practice. Obviously, the Sephardic world was a seafaring world, so it's a traditional Sephardic practice to keep your afikomen, and if you're in trouble, to throw it into the sea. So the afikomen is the better part of the middle matzah, and when we break the middle matzah, we are reminded of the parting of the Red Sea. And the idea is that you throw your matzah into the sea, and either the sea or the Almighty remembers that episode, and it has a calming effect on the waters. So this wasn't something which he invented. It was rather something which came out of the Sephardic world of his childhood. So I'll just read it. Monday evening, 7 o'clock, 26th of November, 1827, on board the Leonidas, Captain John Anderson, about 60 miles southeast from Malta. Since Friday last, we had encountered continual gales of wind, with a heavy sea, our ship leaky, the pumps being kept constantly at work. The gale of yesterday was allowed by the oldest seaman on board to have been terrific, attended by a most dangerous short sea running mountains high. About 10 o'clock, the wind began to abate. After midnight, the sea became rather less agitated. I don't know whether I'm able to bring it down. Let's see if I can. This morning, the sky again assumed its most threatening aspect, dark clouds arising in all directions. Captain and seaman foretelling a repetition of the late dreadful weather. At this awful pause, a little before noon, I threw into the sea a small piece of my last year's Passover cake, laid by on the evening of the Agada, supplicating the Almighty to protect us and to avert the coming tempest, likewise tranquilize the still troubled ocean. Between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening, it is with the warmest gratitude I humbly acknowledge and bear witness to the Almighty's kind interposition in our behalf. The clouds which appeared to everyone on board so dreadfully threatening during the morning have, as it were by a miracle, dispersed. And instead of pouring their fury upon us, the sea also became every hour more and more tranquil. May I forever bear witness and forever bear in remembrance this merciful interposition of God, and annually while I live repeat this fact to those I may have the happiness of being surrounded by on the evening of the Agada. Moses Montefiore. 8:15. The sea is smooth, moon and stars smiling on us. Captain Anderson this moment entered the cabin and said, I have not seen a finer night out of the heavens for many and many a year. That the ship is pretty steady, this writing can attest. Witness, Judith.
Wow. Well, may we all get through the sea of this pandemic, and if chucking a bit of afikomen into some water works, we'll all be doing it, I can tell you, next week. Absolutely fantastic. Just so that you know, because I'm a complete mashugana, we've just done a mosaic in our shul of the windmill at Mishkalot Sha'ananim in our grounds, because in recognition of the fact that we, for 50 years, held a Torah shield that described the blood libel and the intervention of Sir Moses and Lady Judith. I hope we look forward to seeing you in June. It would be lovely to invite you to our shul at some occasion when people can do that kind of thing for another talk. I had fantastic feedback from everybody already in the chat.
Thank
Abigail, can I take this opportunity wishing you, Boaz, Moshe, and all your family, Chag Sameach, a wonderful Pesach, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. And I wish you all a happy and kosher Pesach.
That's that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing.
A fascinating talk.